Hello and welcome to the launch of the Lloyds Register Foundation Safety Perceptions Index, produced by the Institute for Economics and Peace and funded by Lloyds Register Foundation. The index uses data from the World Risk Poll to provide a comprehensive assessment of worries and experiences of risk across 121 countries. This is truly a unique body of work as it provides a deep understanding of citizens' feelings of safety. Today, we are joined by three panelists who will discuss the findings and implications of the report. Following their presentations and remarks, we will open the floor for questions and answers from the audience. You may ask a question via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time during today's presentation, and please be sure to direct your question to a specific speaker. Our first speaker today is Alex Vedovi, who will share with us the findings of the report. Alex is a research fellow at the Institute for Economics and Peace, where his work has focused on peace and violence in Latin America, the impact of climate change on food systems and global migration patterns, and the role of multilateral institutions in facilitating interstate relations and promoting social and economic development. Before joining IEP, Alex worked on health systems research at Macquarie University and on international education policy at the World Bank. Alex holds a master's degree in Latin American studies from Mexico's National University and a bachelor's degree in English and history from the University of California, Davis. I now turn it over to you, Alex, to present the findings of the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's really a pleasure to be presenting on the Safety Perceptions Index. As you mentioned, this is quite a unique body of research, and we feel here at IEP that it'll be of great interest to policymakers, practitioners, and others interested not only in reducing the tangible threats that people feel in their daily lives, but also importantly, reducing the degree to which people perceive their lives as insecure or unsafe. So my presentation consists of a series of slides, which I'll share now. So just to begin with a little bit of an introduction to the Institute for Economics and Peace, we're an independent, not-for-profit think tank dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace. We have our head offices here in Sydney, Australia, as well as offices in New York, Mexico City, Brussels, and Harare, Zimbabwe. And just to quickly give a bit of an overview of the framework that guides the Safety Perceptions Index, I'd like to say a little bit about the source material, which is the Lloyds Register Foundation World Risk Poll, which we found in using the data is a very rich and unique data set that has a lot of fascinating questions related to both new and long-standing risks that people face in their daily lives. In constructing the index, we selected 12 key questions, which primarily deal with more well-known long-standing risks. However, we did draw on other questions from the poll to give sort of dimension and greater understanding to the findings, as well as complementary data from other sources. Now, one of the key sort of benefits we enjoyed in constructing this report was that we were able to look at 2 years of data, both from the 2021 World Risk Poll as well as the 2019 World Risk Poll. And of course, the key development that happened globally in between those 2 years was the onset of COVID-19. And so the report and the index results kind of are able to track the way in which the pandemic shifted the risk landscape globally. And I think explicitly and implicitly throughout the report, we have this finding that it was the societal impact of the pandemic more than, say, the fears about the virus itself that really had an impact on the risk landscape. Now, the index draws on two themes, two sets of questions within the poll. On the one hand, there is people's reported experience of serious harm in the past 2 years. And then on the other, there is people's levels of worry about different harms. And we analyzed these two themes across 5 domains. There was food and water, violent crime, severe weather, mental health, and workplace safety. So for each domain, the rates of experience and worry are averaged to create the SPI scores by domain. And these scores are then averaged for each country to measure the overall SPI score by country. So the level of risk impact is reflective in the SPI score. So a low level of experience and worry when averaged would translate to a low level of impact, whereas a high level of experience and worry about harm would translate to a high level of risk impact. And now just a little bit of an overview of the results across domains. So we found that in the food and water domain, both experience and worry about harm declined or that they improved. And the same was true with regard to violent crime, both experience and worry declined. And this latter finding might not be surprising when considering the impact on social movement and just social engagement that was limited in the context of the pandemic and might have resulted in a decline of the opportunities for violent crime. In the severe weather domain, found that experience of harm increased, but paradoxically, levels of worry declined. And the mental health domain was likely the domain that was most impacted by the pandemic. And we saw a rise in both levels of experience and worry about harm. Both of these increased over the 2-year period. Now, with regard to the workplace safety domain, while there were questions on workplace safety in the 2019 World Risk Poll, these were somewhat different than those posed in the 2021 poll. And as a result, it was determined that these were not mutually comparable. However, we are optimistic that in future iterations of the Safety Perceptions Index, we will be able to draw on mutually comparable questions across years in order to track how feelings about workplace safety have moved over time. And looking at some of the cross-domain results, we find that on average, experience of harm increased slightly, whereas on average, worry declined slightly. And taking a bit of a step back, these sorts of findings, and particularly those related to worry, kind of point to the idea that people were simply worried about different things in 2021 than they were in 2019. And one of the other pieces of research we cite in the report basically speaks to this idea that a given person can only worry about so many things at one time. And so the impact of the pandemic in many ways just shifted in different ways, the ways in which people experienced worry. And one other key finding that is sort of central to the report was this rise in fears related to the unknown. And that I'll delve into a little bit more a little bit later in the presentation. Now, when it comes to country level findings, somewhat surprising, we found that Uzbekistan was the best ranked country in the Safety Perceptions Index, and that the Russia-Eurasia region ranked as the least impacted, risk-impacted region. These results did, I should say, come before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that action may, of course, affect the risk landscape in that part of the world in the years ahead. But I think these findings related to Uzbekistan in particular and the Russia-Eurasia region in general reflect sort of the subjective and the ways in which risk are perceived things. So we found that, for example, this part of the world generally does not perform as well as other parts of the world with regard to most measures of security and development. But if you take a deeper look, we found, for example, that in the 2019 edition of the World Risk Poll, there was a very interesting question about people's understanding of the word risk. People were asked when they hear the word risk, whether they think more of danger or of opportunity. And across the world, in most places, people tended to think more of danger. But in the Russia-Eurasia region, people were more likely than in any other region to select opportunity as the prime meaning. And Uzbekistan was by far the country with the highest rate of people selecting opportunity as the meaning to the word risk. And there were other, I should mention, sort of cultural, political, and social factors that also might have influenced how the Russia-Eurasia region in general and Central Asia in particular would have perceived experiences of harm and reported on them to someone conducting the survey. Now, in contrast, Mali ranked as the most risk-impacted country in the world. It also experienced the greatest deterioration in safety perception index score. And during this 2-year time period, it should be noted that the country experienced 2 violent coups that successfully overthrew the government. And generally speaking, the country has been affected by terrorism and violence over the last several years. And generally speaking, Sub-Saharan Africa ranked as the most risk-impacted region overall. Now, shifting to this question of shifts in the risk landscape, one of the most interesting questions in the World Risk Poll was an open-ended question asking people to identify the greatest threat to their daily safety. And as can be seen in 2021, people responding don't know was by far the most common answer. This was followed by road accidents, crime and violence, and then jumping down one, personal health unrelated to COVID. And we were somewhat surprised to see that COVID-19 itself only garnered about 7% of responses. This was the 5th most common response overall and the 4th most common response if you exclude the don't know response. Other rate changes were more substantial than the rise in new worries about COVID-19. And this, I guess, again suggests that the pandemic's impact on the risk landscape was in many ways more indirect than direct. The largest changes that we saw in response rates to this question were in the don't know category and in the nothing, no risk category. And this finding led to one of the most interesting aspects of the report, which is something that we have termed the rise of ambiguous risk. So the chart on the right shows a swing between 2 sets of response rates. On the one hand, the rate of people reporting no great threat to their daily safety fell by half or more than half. And during the same time, the rate of people being unsure of their greatest threat nearly doubled. This swing occurred in a large majority of countries, 2/3 of countries, and it held true across every demographic category that we looked at, including age, gender, and education level. This swing also comes against the backdrop of a general rise in feelings of unsafety. Another very interesting question in the World Risk Poll asked people to rate their feelings of safety in the present in comparison to 5 years prior. And in 2021, 35% of people felt less safe than they did 5 years prior. And this is up from 30% in 2019. And this rise and this swing among the nothing, no risk, and don't know categories is noteworthy given that the SPI itself showed an overall decline in levels of worry. But again, those were declines in worries related to what we might think of as more conventional risks. These sort of unknown risks did not show this decline. Another element of the report was that it examined the relationships between experience and worry. On the right is a chart showing levels of firsthand experience, all experience, which is a combination of first and secondhand experience, which the poll asked about, and then worry. And we found that violent crime and severe weather are associated with the highest levels of worry, both garnered over 35% of respondents saying they were worried about those two domains. And these two domains also had the highest levels at which worry exceeded firsthand and overall experience of any domain. Now, in contrast, workplace safety showed the lowest level of worry, both in absolute terms and relative to firsthand and overall experience. Workplace safety and mental health were the only risk domains for which levels of overall experience exceeded levels of worry. And these two sets of findings largely align with other research on the relationship between threats and worry, which show that a person's perceived level of controllability over a situation affects how much they worry about it, more so, say, than how frequently they might experience harm from a given threat. So if a person feels they have agency or can affect the outcome of a given threat, they are less likely to worry about it. But with something such as severe weather or crime, they may feel little to no agency. Now, because this was a report largely touching on the impacts of COVID, we chose to address two special themes and look at them in a bit more depth. One of them was in relationship to questions of employment and economic anxieties. As we all know, COVID had a big impact on feelings of job insecurity and perceptions of job insecurity. And we found that amid the downturns of the pandemic, both economic and financial concerns rose for across the world. And we also found that perceptions of relative unsafety rose for every employment. So presented in this chart are 6 employment groups. On the left are employment groups that we termed fully employed. On the far right are groups that are underemployed or unemployed. And in the middle, we have people out of the workforce who may be retired or students or things like that. And unexpectedly, we found that people that are employed full-time experience the largest increase in feeling less safe. And those who are employed full-time for themselves, self-employed people, experience the biggest uptick overall. Now, the second sort of special theme that we chose to address in the report was related to road safety. And this was in light of the changes in patterns of mobility that we're seeing across the globe as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns and whatnot. So we found that in both 2019 and 2021, road safety concerns were the most commonly identified specific risk to daily safety. However, with the declines in mobility associated with COVID, the percentage of people naming safety as their top concern did drop by 5 points. And the report also highlights some of the significant improvements that have been made in recent decades in relation to road safety, things such as traffic laws and usage of seatbelts and things like that. And as a result, road safety has improved globally, despite the fact that the number of cars on the road has really soared. So around the year 2000, there were maybe about 700 million cars on the road. And, by 2019, that had more than doubled to about 1.5 billion cars. Now, even with that increase, road safety accidents and issues have been on the decline. However, as we all know, harm from road incidents remains common, and there are certain groups, particularly young men, who are more frequently impacted than others. Now, this chart shows road injury rates by age and sex. In the orange bars, you have men, and in the blue bars, you have women. And as can be seen, men's rates of injury from road safety incidents are higher than women's across the board. And this is most strikingly the case among men in their 20s. There is a gradual decline as they grow older, but findings of this kind speak to the need for targeted policies that really help specific groups overcome their safety issues. And I think on this note, it's important to highlight that throughout the report, although there was not time to detail all the findings here, there's a variety of demographic specific analyses. So I encourage all of you to download the report and look at it. And with that, I would like to end my presentation by just mentioning that the Institute for Economics and Peace has to put together an R package that is available on this website for anyone interested in exploring the World Risk Poll data in more detail. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. And I'm sure we'll be able to dig a little bit deeper into those findings as well during the question and answer session. For those in the audience, please do use the Q&A function for any questions that you may have. We'll be getting to them after the presentations that we have today. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah Cumbers to share her remarks on these findings. Dr. Cumbers is the Director of Evidence and Insight at Lloyd's Register Foundation, where she leads a team which works to use data and evidence to better understand the complex factors that affect safety. This includes overseeing the World Risk Poll, the unique global survey on public perceptions and experience of risk, on which the Safety Perceptions Index is based. We look forward to hearing your remarks. The floor is yours, Dr. Cumbers.
Thank you, Leah. So Lloyd's Register Foundation is a global safety charity. We've got a mission to improve safety globally through funding education, innovation and research. And the World Risk Poll was commissioned because we want to understand how people perceive and experience risk in their everyday lives. This isn't data that's available. Sometimes there are national statistics that are available, but in many countries across the world, particularly low-income countries, the data simply doesn't exist. And what the World Risk Poll really adds is that flavour of perception in addition to people's experience risk. And so you can then look at the difference between people's perceptions and experiences. And within that gap, quite often there's this opportunity to improve safety. So for example, take food safety. By increasing awareness and action on food safety in areas where harm from unsafe food runs ahead of perceptions of harm, you can really make a difference to people's lives. So it's been really great to partner with the Institute for Economics and Peace on this programme of work. The foundation commissions Gallup to undertake the World Risk Poll, and we've done a certain amount of analysis ourselves. But really, the true value of the data comes when other organisations use the data, and as has happened with the Safety Perceptions Index, starts to bring in other forms of data as well, other data sources, to get far more out of the data. And one of my the really interesting findings, I think, from the SPI this year is this focus on ambiguous risk that Alex mentioned, and I'll look forward to getting further into the discussion about that and what it means, what we can do about it later on in the panel discussion. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you so much. I now have the pleasure to introduce Dr. David Schley. Dr. David Schley is the Deputy Director of Sense About Science, where he leads campaigns and communications for the organization to ensure that science and evidence are used appropriately in public life and that people are empowered with knowledge. This includes the Risk Know-How Project, a global framework that helps communities understand and navigate risk. Dr. Schley, I turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Leah. And Alex, thank you for a comprehensive presentation of the report. I mean, for me, two things kind of stood out from that. I agree. I think the increase in ambiguous risk is really interesting. It sort of paints a picture of an uncertain world. And while I guess you could speculate whether that's a kind of growth of misinformation or poorly evidenced claims out there, I think what's clear is that, you know, people face many different challenges, you know, the challenge of many conflicting risks in their daily lives, and they need to make trade-off. And I think, Alex, you sort of spoke about the need for agency. And I think it's interesting that, I guess for this report, COVID will have had a big impact, but what does COVID risk mean to people? It, you know, we've all talked about the direct physical risk, but, you know, are you worried about the mental health impact of lockdown on your children? Are you worried about your job security? You know, are you worried about just being able to put food on the table? Or are you worried about the erosion of democracy that might have happened due to rules? So there's many conflicting factors there, aren't they? I think the other thing, as Sarah mentioned, that disparity between worry and experience is really interesting, insightful. And it's not inconsistent, is it, for people to have that? So I think for me, the question is really whether people are able to weigh up claims and the data that's available to make informed decisions for their lives. So Leah mentioned the Risk Know-How initiative that Lloyd's Register Foundation fund. And I think these findings kind of resonate with that, you know, the need that program has found, that, you know, we need to recognize that there are thousands of people across the world who are helping their communities kind of navigate risk and make sense of risk every day. And to do that successfully, you know, they need to have the information framed and presented to them in a way that they can use to make those meaningful trade-offs and understand risk. And I think during the discussion, I mean, I'd like to talk a bit more about the Risk Know-How, you know, program, because a key part of that is having provided a framework which information providers can use to address some of those challenges, so that the people who are making and supporting their communities in making these really complex decisions of multiple trade-offs of different risks have the information they need. And as Sarah said, you know, you can make a really change to people's lives by them being able to manage those risks appropriately.
Thank you so much for sharing. So with that, I'd like to move on to the discussion segment of today's event. I invite you to continue to keep asking questions via the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. To kick off the conversation, I'd like to ask our panelists the first question. So this report is really unique because it covers not only experienced harm, but also what we as humanity worry about or perceive as a threat to our safety. I'd be interested in delving a little bit further into this and ask, what are the short-term as well as the long-term consequences if we ignore people's perception of safety alongside this kind of reality of what we actually face? Dr. Cumbers, perhaps you would like to start.
Yeah, happy to start. Thanks, Leah. I mean, what the World Risk Poll really gives us is a very granular understanding of people's risk perceptions and experience. And it's really important to say, you know, Alex's great presentation has presented the global level findings, but it's really when you start to dig down into the data that you appreciate that actually risk perceptions and experience are very much driven by people's individual context. And so it's really, really important that we pay attention to that, because each individual has a different risk landscape, and they have a different reaction to risk, and they're going to, you know, take or not, you know, action on risk to different extents. So it's really, really important that we understand that, and then we act on that information. Because, as I've said, there's a big link with safety here, and risk and safety go very much hand in hand. And, you know, I think COVID is going to come up quite a lot in this discussion today. And Alex presented the data on top of the mind risk for COVID, where COVID was the most fourth commonly reported risk. And this was in year 2 of the pandemic. And we know that at the time, policymakers and public health professionals are really very much focused on working to keep people safe from COVID with a range of measures. But the data here suggests that actually, for the majority of people around the world, it was other risks that were more present in their daily lives. You know, road traffic, crime and violence. The fine road traffic may have fallen since 2019, but it was still still there, you know, for a majority of respondents. And so the key message here, you know, is that individuals and policymakers and organisations who are wanting to present messages about their own priority risks must do so within the everyday context of the people that they're talking to. So they need to know their community, they need to understand the context within which they're dealing with risk, and they need to present the risk you know, mitigation measures in that, you know, with that information in mind.
And Dr. David Schley, perhaps you also want to weigh into this short-term.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sarah's covered it really well. I think, you know, if we ignore people's perceptions, then we're going to fail to empower them to manage those risks appropriately. You know, people are having to make really complex trade-offs in different situations, and only a local expert, as it were, is going to be able to do that and balance it. So, you know, I think the risk is, if we don't perceive it, we're going to end up not understanding people and blaming them. You know, for example, you may see a fisherman going out to fish despite the fact that there's a forecast of a cyclone. That doesn't mean they don't understand the weather forecast. It may mean that they have also looked at the risk of their family not having any food and have made a trade-off. So as Sarah said, I think information providers, you need to provide that, you know, that information has to be structured in such a way that it's accessible and that people can make those trade-offs. And I think, you know, let's make those trade-offs transparent because it is a challenge. But yeah, whereas we might, you know, we might work, we might work in food safety, and that's very important, but that's only one aspect of someone's life.
Absolutely. Good. Alex, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think just one additional point on that question. One of the nice innovations about the 2021 edition of the World Risk Poll was that when people were asked an initial question about their experience of risk, that initial question was phrased in a way that asked them to state their personal experience or someone that they knew. And in 2019, that was where the question ended. But in the 2021 edition, there was a follow-up question if someone responded, yes, I or someone I know has experienced this, which asked whether it was, you know, a first-hand experience, a second-hand experience, or both. And I think one of the very interesting sort of dynamics was looking across domains. There wasn't necessarily a direct correlation between first-hand experience and second-hand experience. There were certain domains of harm where people seem to be much more conscious of the experiences of others. So for example, if someone experienced harm from violent crime, it is likely that they would be much more likely to know of that if their neighbor or their family member had experienced it. But if it was something related to, say, water safety, you know, someone got sick from unclean water or something like that, they may only have been conscious of their own experience and not the experience of others. And I think this result also is interesting when considering the impact of media and how media shapes people's perceptions of the risks they should be worried about, but also the risks that they may be perceiving themselves to be experiencing. So these are like very subtle and nuanced dynamics that I think the World Risk Poll really allows us to unpack.
Great, thank you. And I want to ask a follow-up question for Dr. Sarah Cumbers, kind of on these challenges that we face when polling on this topic specifically. So what are the biggest challenges that people or anyone in this field faces when they're trying to assess risk?
Yeah, thanks. I think David started to unpick this already, and there's a big link here with the Risk Know-How programme. Firstly, you've got the skills that individuals need to enable them to understand and then act on risk information. And here it's not just about being numerate, you know, being good with numbers, but also being able to examine claims, for example, about the size and the importance of risk, to trade off risks, as David was mentioning, you know, being able to make reasonable comparisons between the potential risk, and then the costs of action and inaction. But on the flip side of that, of course, is that even if an individual has all of those skills and is empowered to be able to assess risk effectively, if the right information isn't shared with them, then it's not going to enable understanding and action. And so there's also a responsibility here, or a challenge here, for information providers to be presenting information with clarity, and also, as we've mentioned, in the individual's own context. And so you need both of those elements to be in place, the skills and the information, to enable assessment of risk.
Great, thank you. And moving into this kinds of roles and responsibilities that everybody has in these assessments, Dr. Schley, perhaps you'd like to speak to this question of which actors are most important when we're talking about mitigating the worries and reducing the experiences of harm in communities. And someone in the audience has also asked specifically, what can the private sector and government invest in to start to make changes in people's lives? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not sure. Do we want to mitigate what people's worries? I mean, they might be quite valid. I think we do want to empower people to manage their risk, and absolutely, so they can, you know, reduce the harmful experiences and the impact those have. And I think Sarah's explained very well. I think, you know, key actors are, I think, those people in the community who are helping to understand those risks. And yes, we need to give them the risk know-how to work with it. But the other part is them having the information in the right form, you know, and that's where I think the risk know-how framework, again, can be used as a tool by information providers to actually look at, you know, assess how they're putting out resources and information to people. If I'm a farmer and I'm having to choose between, you know, a high yield crop and a drought resistant crop, then what does the 1 in 100 year weather event mean to me? Because it certainly doesn't mean that if it happened last year, I'm safe for 99 years. So in terms of providing that information in a way that's accessible, I think that's where, you know, the actors can step up. And I would say for those big information providers, the challenge is, you know, as well as making your data transparent, your role is not to provide statistics. Your role is to answer meaningful questions. So it's about how that's framed. So maybe that goes some way towards, in terms of what, you know, what can private and public sector do in terms of investment. I think it is looking about how you're sharing that information in a meaningful and accessible way. And as I said, I think, you know, the risk know-how framework with Lloyds Foundation provides a good kind of a global structure, because it's based on the insights and experiences of hundreds of sort of community risk practitioners who've basically spoken to us and said, this is how we need information, this is how we understand information. So I think there's certainly lots that can be done to improve that.
And Leah, can I just jump in as well, just to mention a couple more questions that the World Risk Poll asked that weren't covered by Alex in his presentation. But we asked within the poll about sources of information that people use and people trust when they're informing themselves about particular risks. And so, for example, in 2019, we asked about sources of information around unsafe food, and then in 2021 about information to help people deal with a disaster. And the poll shows us again here that context matters. I mean, this is a thread that's running through this discussion, because we find that people from different backgrounds, for example, from different income groups, trust different people or trust different sources. It might be an organisation, it might be, you know, a news outlet, for example. So, for example, globally, the top trusted source of disaster information is local news. But we also see that people in low-income countries, after local news, are then far more likely to turn to local religious leaders as their second most trusted source than are people in high-income countries. So again, it's about knowing your community. So going back to that audience question about what governments and businesses can do, there isn't an easy one size answer to that. Well, I suppose there is. It's know your community, and then act on their specific needs and their specific context. You need to know who they're likely to turn to and trust, then to invest in those actors and empower them, in terms of actually providing them with the skills and the right information to then support the local community.
Brilliant, thanks. And I think this feeds into one of the questions that came from the audience quite well. Alex, you had touched on it a little bit, but it would be interesting, I mean, to also have all of you speak to this fact of the translation of a word like risk in different communities when you're doing these polling, when you're doing the surveys. How can we draw out and conclusions regardless of these differences in definitions, Alex?
Yeah, I think it's a sizable challenge, I think I mean most of the work we did with the Safety Perceptions Index was around the words worry and experience, but I think even with words like that, you can have a wide range of interpretations, and also you have questions of for example, how well a person might remember a given experience, or how well they might remember the experience of others, what sort of time frame they might put on that. I don't know if there's a one size fits all solution, but I think it certainly requires maybe with surveyors or people trying to implement programs, really investing in good translation, really investing in people with local knowledge, maybe not even knowledge, of the country level, but maybe more at a subnational level in a village context, or in a more rural context. You really need to ensure that when you're asking these questions, your people are understanding. And I think that's a challenge probably that has plagued surveyors for decades. But I think certainly with something as specific as risk, which in English, has 1,000 meanings. When you start moving that word into 100 other language, you're dealing with maybe millions of definitions. So I think it's just a question of implementing polls like the World Risk Poll, looking at results, seeking to gauge to what degree results are culturally driven rather than experience driven, and then refining your approaches iteratively.
And Leah, if I can just say a little bit about Gallup's responsibility here, that Lloyds Register Foundation commissions Gallup, as I've mentioned, to run the World Risk Poll, and they have a huge amount of experience of localizing instruments like the World Risk Poll. And so the questions go through 2 rounds of testing, cognitive testing in a range of different countries, and then pilot testing in a greater number of countries with a greater number of participants. And then once the instrument is finalized, and we've just finalized the instrument for the 2023 poll, in fact, just before Christmas, and it's now within that phase of local translation. And so Gallup work with local partners in each of the countries that they're polling in, and they spend a lot of time getting that translation right, and really using their experience and their knowledge and their understanding, and working with locals to make sure that we know what we're getting in relation to the data. And the other thing to say is that because the poll is repeated, as long as you look at the poll findings with that, through that lens of understanding that actually there may be a cultural impact here, the data is still valid and is still very, very useful. So take Uzbekistan, for example. Alex has mentioned that it scored very, very well in relation to in relation to the SPI, but you can still look at change. And so you can still compare, if you polled in Uzbekistan in 2019 and 2021, you can see that within that cultural lens, there may still be changes. And that gives you useful information. It gives you a signal. It gives you something that you can then follow up with the local community to say, actually, here's something that we think that if it's acted on, we could improve safety within this community.
And I think that the challenge of translation is one that perhaps sits more at the polling level. So, it's Gallup who have to work out that. If you talk about work safety, does that mean job security to someone, or does it mean accident risk to somebody else? I think it becomes less of an issue when you actually work on it on the ground. So I think if you're starting to address the issues in real life in context, then for us community risk practitioners, they are your local radio presenter, they are a midwife, they are sort of your fisheries manager, and I think in that sense you get the meaning their meaning frames what the risk definition is in situ. So I think in practice it's less of a challenge, but it's certainly a challenge for a global poll and the analysis that Alex is trying to do.
Thank you. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into the findings within the report as well. Alex, you had mentioned during your presentation that there are a number of interesting findings that are, that are dependent on the age and the gender of the respondents as well. I was wondering if you'd like to share a little bit more about those findings that are age or gender specific.
Yeah, so there's a lot of very interesting dynamics on those two fronts. Generally speaking, the poll confirmed a finding globally that, or in other research, I should say, that as people get older, their levels of worry tend to decline. So older individuals just, I guess, stop worrying as much. And levels of worry among young people are much higher. But then when we dug a little bit deeper and tried to examine some of the relationships between people's experience of harm relative to their levels of worry, it's a bit more of a mixed picture. So because older individuals may experience less frequently many of the harms outlined in the risk poll relative to their experience, their levels of worry actually often outstrip their level, those levels among younger cohorts. Now, this is sort of domain specific. So, for example, people over the age of 65, the Lloyds poll showed actually worry about something like mental health less frequently than they have first or second-hand experiences of it. And that is the reverse of the experience of younger people. But if you look at something like violent crime, relative to their first or second-hand experiences of violent crime, older individuals worry about things much more frequently. So it's a very sort of complex picture. And on the question of gender, we actually encountered some expected and somewhat surprising results. Overall, we found that men and women across the 5 domains of the Lloyds poll have first and second-hand experiences of harm from those 5 domains at more or less the same levels. However, women tend across the board to have higher levels of worry than men do. But even looking within domains, men's levels of harm experience were generally on par with women's. The only domain where we found relatively notable discrepancy was in the area of workplace harm, where men were several points higher in their rates of experience of harm than women. But it was striking to see that harm experience levels overall were quite similar. Men and women also showed different patterns of relative worry, both for things like violent crime, where women were much more frequently worried about violent crime relative to their experience. And men showed a strikingly low level of worry, a low level of concern about mental health concerns relative to their experience. So their level of first and second-hand experience of mental health harms was actually higher than.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting. We've also had a number of questions come in from the audience about the impact of COVID and what kind of impact that has had on the risk perception landscape. Alex, I was wondering if you would be able to speak to this from the research itself, and Dr. Schley, we'd also be really interested to hear from you about your experience with this as well. Alex?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the key findings of the World Risk Poll was in relation to this term, ambiguous risk, and this was something that we examined and looked at in connection to a number of factors, but one of them was unsurprisingly social media and internet usage. So David already referenced issues related to disinformation and information sources. But one thing that was quite noteworthy was in just a 2-year period between 2019 and 2021, the World Risk Poll showed nearly a 10-point increase in rates of use of the internet. So between 2019 and 2021, the number or the percentage of people using internet in the past 30 days jumped from about 52% to about 61%, which is quite a sizable change in just 2 years. And inhabiting a world in which a pandemic is running rampant, and having access to the internet can be a double-edged sword. And we believe, and this is, of course, the source of a lot of analysis around the world, that information sources, while maybe providing comfort to people and being a necessary resource, also allowed bad information to circulate the globe and cause unnecessary fears and unnecessary levels of worry. And I guess shifting to a more online life no doubt had major impacts on people's perceived threats.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think that the whole, COVID experience, it opened up a whole new world for many people. There's a whole new language being brought forth. Who would imagine that for some of us, we'd see our politicians with data graphs and epidemiological data that, bit presented in public, sharing data. And, in most countries, we live through kind of real-time discussions and assessments of risk happening in the public domain. So in that sense, I think it's kind of opened up that world of having to, how risks are assessed and how they're managed. That said, I feel that's a long way off from saying that we've empowered people. We at Centre About Science have looked at the UK in particular, and for us, for example, our analysis is that our government, I think, took quite an authoritarian approach to information in terms of giving people basic rules about what to do, rather than being what we would call authoritative, which is about really sharing all that information in a way that people can use. So for us, the experience was that many people weren't able to make complicated trade-offs in their lives because they weren't given the full information, but rather were simply given very simplistic rules, which then often conflict with so many other rules, because you get a rule about health or face masks, but you also got rules about child safety and other other obligations you have in your sphere. And again, for that, it's about helping people to be able to unpack the information and the risk, and not try and simplify it and distill it and assume that because with the best will in the world, government can't possibly understand all the different complex situations that people are living in. So we need to empower people to make those assessments themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps as one final question on the specific of the reports, Alex, where can we see significant discrepancies in places that experience forms of harm and the perceptions of risk? And why is that? If that does exist, what are the implications of this, and what can be done about this?
Sure. So one special section we have in the report that I think really speaks to this question is the case of Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan has the highest level of experience of of harm of any country counted in the World Risk Poll. But its levels of worry were quite low, at least within Safety Perceptions Index. And I think that has to do with the sorts of domains covered in the Safety Perceptions Index. So, for example, if you're looking at things like violent crime, food and water, mental health, etc., all of these things are, huge risks in most people's everyday lives. But not covered in that is something like war and terrorism. And in the open-ended question about asking people to just identify the top threat they perceive in their lives, Afghanistan had over 60% of participants identify war and terrorism as their top risk. And in the whole 121 countries, there were only 2 instances in which a national population selected a single category at a rate over 50%. And one of those was Afghanistan. So if you aren't speaking to the full array of people's risks, and of course it's impossible to count every single risk there is in the world, you may not be capturing what is worrying a given population most. And another thing that we discuss in that section, trying to unpack this unique dynamic in Afghanistan, is the ways in which people might have become desensitized to some of the risks and some of the threats they face in their daily lives as a result of decades of persistent warfare and violence. So I think understanding the ways people perceive the threats in their lives, perceive their own levels of safety, it's a very relative exercise. And the case of Afghanistan, I would encourage anyone interested in understanding sort of a unique case study to look at the report and read that section, because I think it gives a good case to look at.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. And I want to also repeat that please do look at the report online. We've posted it in the chat and it's also on our websites. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for today, and there are so many interesting, great questions in the chat. I thank the audience for being so interactive. If you'd like to connect with any of us, please follow all of our organizations are on social media. Feel free to reach out and ask questions about our research in this report. I'd like to thank each of our 3 panelists for sharing their expertise, and for everyone in the audience for joining us today. Please be sure to read the report. It's again in the chat, and also you can find it on our website, visionofhumanity.org. We hope great session. Thanks.
Thank you.